Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. And joining today, we are delighted to have someone of such intelligence and integrity. And of course, I'm not talking about Richard Kemp. We are talking about Wera Hobhouse MP, the MP for Bath, who is joining us today. So how are you doing, Vera? It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's very nice to be here. And it's weather is not great in Bath. I don't know what is up there where you are.
Throwing it down, absolutely throwing it down. Yeah.
We don't normally let Southerners on, Vera, but I did explain that you used to live in Liverpool and were a councillor in Rochdale. So in your case, we've made an exception, haven't we, John?
We have, a very special exception. But Vera, going on to obviously what we want to talk about now is, firstly, how's life as an MP at the moment during coronavirus? How are you dealing with lockdown and trying to have a voice for your residents in Parliament and things like that?
It is a big challenge, to be quite honest, because certainly the new virtual parliamentary procedures make it particularly difficult for a smaller party. And the way we can interact in the chamber when we can bob, which is basically the equivalent of putting your hand up to say, I want to speak. All these possibilities are not there, so everything is pre-arranged and it's done on a proportional or political balance basis. And that always puts it at a very big disadvantage. But you know what? You always have to try your best and see your opportunities and work actually a lot with social media. So, for example, I couldn't make my speech because I was far too far down the list. And then I made my speech in my sitting room and published it anywhere on my social media channels.
Excellent.
Have you been down to London at all?
No. And we have made a decision as a Lib Dem MPs group that we actually want to see how much we can make the virtual parliament work, because it could actually bring in new working practices, and we need to get Parliament out of its very old-fashioned practices and the ridiculous ways we are voting, for example. So if this lockdown actually brings in some innovation into parliamentary procedure, that would be very good. But of course, we feel we would undermine it as soon as we all flock back into the chamber.
Mm. Any lessons for councils there, do you think?
I think that the fact that suddenly, because of the crisis, you can have big screens in the chamber. I don't know whether you've got the opportunities in your council chambers, which allows people on the odd occasion, but also people possibly, if you're a council, so residents to come in with questions and you can see them on screen, for example. These new bits of innovation technology might actually help us to engage better with our residents.
And is that what you're doing now? Presumably people are still contacting you as their MP, wanting to take up benefits or whatever cases. Are you using Zoom or FaceTime so you can talk to them, or is it just emails?
No, my weekly surgeries are now just telephone calls, and we haven't really started Zoom meetings yet, because it will then assume that people know how to use the technology, and I think one shouldn't assume that. And people who come to my surgery are often those who are actually vulnerable and don't necessarily have online facilities or the knowledge of how to use new technology. And I certainly don't want to build up more barriers. It's important that people find it easy to get hold of me. And a telephone call is, after all, in many ways, that's something that most people can do.
Yeah.
We talked to Alistair Carmichael, who said maybe the volume of casework has reduced now slightly as we're going to lockdown, but the complexity of casework has increased, and the types of issues you're dealing with. Is that what you're also getting? Is it you get ever more complex issues to do with all the different aspects of coronavirus and lockdown?
So certainly the volume of casework hasn't reduced at all. In fact, it has, in our case, tripled. And the additional problem is, sometimes we do get multiple emails, because somebody has got a campaign. And obviously during the Brexit debate, we got multiple, big campaigns where we just could send out one reply to 50 or 100 people writing in. And now we are getting the same volume, but everybody on a slightly different subject. And I had to, in the end, resort to some sort of collective response, because for me, the most important thing as an MP is that you reply quickly. It's no good that I reply to people in 3 or 4 weeks' time and a lot of stuff has already moved on. So we decided to write and rewrite every week a sort of general email back to people who contact us, unless they are on very specific things or on a particular campaign, where we basically list all the contacts they can go to, either that be our council helpline, or that be advice from the NHS, or that be advice from the government, and list them all. Say at the beginning that we're sorry that we are writing a more general response, and then put a few of my political points in there. And sometimes, you know what, people come back and say, oh, Vera, that was a generalized response and that wasn't the question I was asking. And then I can always come back. But to be quite honest, most people are satisfied that I write back to them, and I write back to them in time.
Yeah, and you're the spokesman for climate change within the party. So this is obviously an incredible moment for obviously the world in terms of how it adapts to coronavirus. And a lot of people, obviously, we've seen a massive reduction in emissions and travel and everything else, and giving the voice of, well, we can't go back to the way things were regarding climate change. So how do you see the things we can learn from this crisis?
So what we learned from this crisis is that if something is really seen as a crisis, we can adapt very quickly and do something very different very soon. And I think because the climate emergency is less visible or less tangible, people don't look at it as a crisis in the same way they have looked at the corona crisis. And that's in a way bad for the prospect of tackling the climate emergency, because I believe it is as much of a crisis in many ways than the current health crisis that we have. But people don't quite look at it like this. So action is always delayed, and we know now that climate action delay is as bad as climate action denial, because we are running out of time each month, each year, that we delay action makes it more difficult to actually get to the halting of the rise in temperatures that is needed in order to avoid a climate catastrophe. So what can we learn? We can learn that we can actually very quickly do things differently. But the additional challenge now that is posed from COVID is that, to be quite honest, tackling the climate emergency requires a lot of investment, and probably quite a lot of government investment. And government is now so concentrating on just recovering from the economic fallout of the health crisis, that the extra investment that we really needed in order to push on climate action it might be under threat. And I think we need to campaign very quickly, very hard now, once people are out of the immediate danger of mass infection. When we're talking about the economic recovery, we need to talk about a green recovery.
And I suppose that perfectly leads on to the next question. Just quickly before you come in, Richard, is that if the economy is going to take a huge shock because of this crisis, and it will be very easy for the government to ignore the need to make sure we do have a green recovery, not just the quickest possible recovery. And well, actually, you could probably say the quickest possible recovery is a green recovery, because if we want to get our economy back on track, actually embracing green technologies must surely be part of it.
I couldn't agree more. But the challenge is indeed that, for example, let's take the oil industry. So the thing that people are focusing now on is retaining jobs. So people who are working in the oil industry, rather than spending money on retraining them in order to make them fit to go into alternative jobs that are not based on the oil industry, that sort of investment into people is not going to be there, because currently we just need to save their jobs, which is perfectly understandable. But to be clever about shifting people away from the old, fossil fuel jobs to jobs in the sustainable energies factor, and so on and so forth, a green economy. Those are additional challenges now, because currently, the only thing is we try to contain the economic fallout. and the extra investment and the extra imagination and the freedom to think and be creative of how do we do the transition, all of that could easily be delayed because we are just fearful currently.
But as politicians at local or national level, we can introduce laws, regulations and ideas, but it's always struck me that to make climate change action be effective, we've got to change the culture of every single 66 million people who live here. Now, as I've talked to people through the pandemic, people have been saying things like, for the first time ever, I can hear the birds sing in Penny Lane. I've heard people, I had a conversation with someone who lives 300 yards from one of our most beautiful parks. And he said, Councillor, I haven't been in here for years. I see families, because I'm sitting now in my front room in the bay window. I've just seen a family of 4 cycle past. And I've seen more people. So more people now are talking about climate change in a positive way. How do you think we as Lib Dems, and for that matter, how should the country, the government, build on this realization that just didn't exist 6 or 7 weeks ago?
So I think you're absolutely right. At the bottom of what we're experiencing now is that we are starting to think a little bit more collectively and in solidarity with each other. And I think that's a basic assumption that we need to have for tackling the climate emergency, because it's not just about us, it's a global crisis, and we need to do it in order to create global justice, or at least address the huge global injustices that the climate emergency throws up. So making people think more globally and more collectively and more in solidarity is something that we can definitely take out of that crisis. And then, of course, the enjoyment of nature is one of the big positives that we see in this crisis. And indeed, I mean, we have said many times as climate campaigners that there are many mental health benefits, and there are mental physical health benefits from actually transitioning into a different type of economy away from fossil fuels. Absolutely. But yes, how do we tackle our dependency on the car? I agree. It's nice to see so many more people walking and cycling out there. And they're doing that because they feel safe to do it, or safer to do it, than when our roads are congested with cars or cars zooming past. And one of the biggest barriers to encouraging young people particularly to cycle to school or walk to school is road safety. So is there an opportunity now to, for example, get some meaningful road safety measures in place that are here because of the corona crisis and social distancing? For example, traffic calming, or 20-mile-per-hour zones, or widening of footpath, or taking whole bits of road out and make them for cycles only. And those are initiatives that councils can take, and take those changes over into a world after lockdown. Those are big questions, big opportunities, great opportunities for councils like Liverpool City Council. And indeed, I'm exploring that with some council colleagues, what we could suggest or where we could help.
But yes, so at the moment, though, everyone is fighting the crisis, and obviously that has to be our first priority. Do you think the party and the government are beginning to think effectively of what happens as we go through and out of lockdown on these and other issues?
Well, obviously you can ask me directly about talking about how to get out of the crisis and do that so that we create a green economy and not business as usual or before COVID-19. And do I think about it? Yes. Am I now looking for making the case for what we should do? I am. It's the difficulty for me, and I have just been talking about it in the last hour, about what case can I make that doesn't sound too academic and complicated, because quite a lot of this stuff is really quite technical. So, for example, when I talked to a green energy company yesterday, and they were saying, one of the good things about the coalition government, and I know there's lots of criticism about the coalition government, but certainly when it came to our lead in the Department for Climate Change, was to create a competitive market. And market and competition is not always the best solution, but in order to get new players into the sort of energy provider field, it was important to create a market and create contracts for differences, for example. Often people don't even know what they are. But currently, through the corona virus crisis, we're taking back the opportunity for smaller energy providers to come onto the market, and for making it easier for people to switch. The mechanisms for all of these things are quite complicated and not particularly sexy in terms of a political message. And I think the biggest challenge around the whole of the climate emergency is that quite a lot of the solutions are quite in the detail and quite technical, and how to package them up so that actually the public understands what they are, and then we get the buy-in that you've been talking about. And it's not some sort of academic ivory tower thing, but something that people can really touch. And that's around the messages around warmer homes, or that green energy providers can actually provide the energy at the same price as fossil fuel providers. These sort of things are important. But let's say the green energy company that I was talking to and said, we are now as cheap as a traditional energy company. They need certain mechanisms in order to be there and in order to grow their customer base. And how does a government, and that is ultimately then also about government and legislation, regulation, how does that get encouraged or discouraged ultimately from government?
What about bollocks to climate change? That seems to go down very well in another sphere, doesn't it? Will you bleep that, John?
I'll bleep that. I will. I do apologise, Vera. It's his potty mouth. He can't help himself. But
somebody was saying bollocks to climate change. I would say bollocks to climate change. Yeah.
Oh, well. Right, you have to bleep her twice as much now.
Yeah, well, God, right, a bunch of troublemakers this week. But Vera, if you don't mind, I want to talk a little bit about what happened in Bath. 2015. We obviously lost the seat, and from Don Foster, who was the previous MP, decided not to stand again. The turnaround, for those people that don't know, has been absolutely phenomenal in Bath. So I just want to read out a few figures to make sure I get this right. So in 2015, when we lost the seat, we got 14,000 votes. And then last year, in 2019, we got 28.4 thousand votes, taking 54% of the vote, with a majority of over 12,000. I mean, that is staggering, utterly staggering. So how did you go about that, Vera? I mean, what did your team decide? Was it just, right, we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to take our city back?
So I think the most important thing, and actually, Don Foster was a very well-loved MP for 23 years. And he first became the MP in 1992, and what he managed to hold together was what I'd call a progressive alliance. And in 2015, that was what broke down after the coalition government, because no longer could we persuade to bring together a progressive alliance where Green voters and Labour voters would support the Liberal Democrats. Because the Tory vote was always roughly around the same percentages, and that hasn't really changed in all those years. So I'd say, and this is also, I think, for us, and the challenge to go forward. And I know in Labour-facing areas, it's a bigger challenge than in Tory-facing areas. But certainly for Tory-facing areas like Bath, the most important thing is to make sure we bring together a progressive alliance, and that we were able to build, and that is because we LibDems, we just have very good policies on a lot of stuff, and be that on the climate emergency, and be that making sure that and I've got a very big Green Party bit in my electorate, that they see that I take the climate emergency seriously. But I have been campaigning on social housing, for example, for a long time. I think it's absolutely incredibly soul-destroying to see the lack of social housing that creates so much misery in our communities, and what I'd call the complete destruction of the welfare state that the Tory government has created over the last years. And to make sure that we as Liberal Democrats are seen as a party that supports and a disparty policy, that we actually, as a social good, build, up to 100,000 new social homes for rent. That's what we need. And I think we need to reestablish ourselves as a party that, yes, campaigns passionately on particular issues, but it has got the pragmatic solutions for things. We are not ideological in the way that other political parties are. We see the problems. We understand that we need to support the most vulnerable, and how do we do that? And then provide actually practical solutions of what and how that should be delivered. And for that reason, I still believe we are just the most powerful party and the most powerful mix.
But what you were describing there, Wera, was a progressive alliance of voters, but not a progressive alliance of parties. And I think some people have misunderstood your claim there, because in most of the country, for example, Liverpool, Rochdale, the Labour Party aren't a progressive party.
And I would totally agree with that. And I did my politics in Rochdale, which was the most conservative with a small c, the Labour Party. And you're absolutely right. So, and it is a difficulty, isn't it, to actually decouple Labour from being seen as a progressive party. And if we are taking the lead in being the progressive force in this country, because you know what, I do believe the majority of people in this country are actually progressives, and for that reason, and our rubbish voting system obviously leads to the Conservative Party winning in this ridiculous way. Although I think the majority of people in terms of if you count all the votes together, are actually not a right-wing Conservatives. They're not.
And it's interesting what you say about policy as well. One thing that's come up a couple of times in our podcast is that we have very good policies, but we don't sell them. And sometimes the only policies we do get any attention of are fairly smaller fry, so not the big ticket items. So how can we bridge that gap? How can we suddenly get more attention? Because we know the media is not going to give us a hand. How do we do that? Do we couple it with fantastic local campaigning, winning more councils, and then people will hear us on the other stuff?
I mean, one of our biggest strengths is that we are a grassroots party, and that we are about community campaigning. And I have often said we are the party of local government, and that's seen as if I don't have any ambition, as if local government was some sort of second-rate thing. And I always find it miserable that Westminster, and fair enough, I'm now a member of Parliament, but I've always said I'd rather be the leader of a council than a backbench MP. And yet, if you look at my leader of the council, Dina Romero, she's probably less well recognised than me as the MP. This discrepancy, or this disadvantage really that local government and councils always have in comparison with national MPs, and why that is when most of what people experience of public services and local democracy is actually delivered from our local councils. So a culture change in actually rebalancing the national with the local level is always one of our big long-term aims as Liberal Democrats, and it is a fight worth fighting, because I do believe democracy would be so much better if it was recognized for being local. And we are fighting for localism all along, and have been, and local campaigning is just absolutely vital for our success across the board. And I do believe we made progress in Bath, such good progress in Bath in the general election, because we had a local election, all-out local election in May 2019, where in Bath we swept the board. But that preceded a year of intense campaigning, and my local council colleagues have just done a fabulous job. It sort of really goes hand in hand. We also have parish councils, and I always say, never forget the opportunity to campaign. Never turn your nose up against even a smallish job in a parish council, because all of that helps us to build up support. Our membership is still, and we've just seen figures, our membership is still very healthy. So we do have a lot of support out there. We just have to always work harder than other parties in order to get elected.
And I suppose I have to ask you, because we currently have no leader, or we have an acting leader. Do you still have ambitions to become leader of the party?
Well, I have put, I'm together with Leila Moran, we are so far the only declared candidates in the race, and I have not pulled out. I think the delay in the leadership campaign is unfortunate. Obviously, we've understood why it was necessary. I think there's now a big debate going on on the federal board of how long this delay should be, because I believe the longer we don't have an elected leader, the more difficult it becomes for us as a party to get heard. And it's not fair on the acting leader, but it's certainly also not fair on party members. They want to have a clear direction. So I think the contest, it would be good to have it not too far in the future. And so far, I am there in the mix, and let's see how far I get.
Now we have a majority of women MPs. Are you going to give us men a fair chance if you were the leader there?
I think we should always keep in mind to support minorities and those guys who are underrepresented, and until very recently women were underrepresented, but we have got we have got, unfortunately, still not made as good progress with other underrepresented groups, and there are many other underrepresented groups which we need to encourage. And yes, at some point, Richard, it might include white men with beards. I can't quite see
mustaches, yeah, with facial hair anyway. Well, we are Lib Dems, aren't we? Yeah. We've just recorded another podcast with two people who I would be so proud to see as our MPs. That's Laura Gordon in Sheffield Hallam and Lisa Smart in Stockport. But when I looked at the women we have in this party, quite seriously, I think you are our future. But
oh, that's kind.
It was a very wry comment.
Any monoculture is boring, yeah? So yeah. I'm only ever fighting for a 50-50 parliament. As soon as it became balanced against the other way, I'd say, well, that's not right. We need to try and create a representative parliament, because each voice matters. It's just if other voices get excluded because we've got too many of one particular part, that's when it becomes an issue.
Yeah.
Do you think... Obviously, as someone who wants to become the new leader of the party, looking at how Jo Swinson was treated, because I think very unfairly by some quarters, do you think there's an innate kind of misogyny within politics in Britain that actually women face harsher criticism than men, particularly MPs?
Absolutely. I thought Jo was very unfairly treated, and we have a wash up at some point about what went right or wrong in the election campaign. And I always find, having done a lot of elections and having probably lost more than one, if you're a veteran of elections, then you know that each time you win an election, everything you did was right. When you lose an election, everything you did was wrong. So.
I think quite right, Vera. If you lose an election, it's everything your agent did was wrong.
or whatever, but we are often a little bit rash of not really being very clear about what did actually go right and what went wrong. And I supported Jo in the leadership election last time. I was proud to have her as my leader. She was a young woman and brought a lot of new stuff to the plate. And the difficulty was that she was thrown into a general election straight away. And yes, I think a lot of comments were very unfairly targeted on her because she was a woman, and this sort of girly swap thing. I mean, come on. And no man would have ever had to be exposed to these type of criticisms. I think you're absolutely right there. At the same time, I think I'm always somebody to say, okay, we know about our challenges anyway. We can moan about it, or we can try and can try and do something about it. You know what I mean? And I think, first of all, drawing attention to that is very important. But there obviously then in the granular detail things that have led to exacerbate the criticism against Jo, and she's no longer our leader, but if she was our leader, I'm sure we could have gone more into the detail. What about her image and the way it was portrayed within the campaign just didn't resonate with the electorate? Because when we lose elections, I'm not necessarily saying the people are wrong, because people vote on things, and then you have to look at it and think, what didn't resonate in our campaign? And we can obviously go again and again over the revoke position, or was it the combination of, in my mind, the revoke position plus that I can be the next prime minister, which didn't work for me. So I can be the next prime minister plus we are going to revoke Article 50. The combination of the two I thought was particularly toxic. Anyway, as I say, there's going to be endless, maybe, but still a proper digest of what went wrong and what went right in the general election campaign. Anyway.
And I think you're right. It's all too easy to almost, like Labour Party did after the election in December, almost blame the voters. Don't blame the people for voting in a Donald Trump. Look at the reasons why they voted for Donald Trump. Why did those areas think they needed to change so badly into something like that? That's the essence of what we've got to do.
But is it going to be harder for you in Bath? I mean, I think you said you've eradicated the Labour Party. We've eradicated the Tory Party here. But is it going to be harder with Keir Starmer there?
It's a good question. Obviously, he's very new in the job currently, so he has a bit of a honeymoon, and let's wait and see how it is going for him. I mean, for us as LibDems, to be quite honest, Corbyn was just so toxic that didn't help us at all. To have a functioning opposition, and I think we always have to recognise that ultimately, on the whole, as Liberal Democrats, we do well when the Labour Party does well. To have such a miserable opposition and now ending up with the most right-wing government in a generation is obviously not the outcome that we would have ever wanted. And I blame, in that case, I really blame Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party under his leadership for that terrible opposition in the last 2.5 or 3 years. And if that was the outcome of 2019, that we got rid of Corbyn at least, and that's at least one positive, because he was really bad. And you could only say, I mean, anybody could only do better than Corbyn, to be quite honest. But he was very popular for a while. And again, you have to think, why was that? Because he certainly engaged and infused a young generation of voters and activists to a point that many Labour leaders hadn't done. So let's wait and see how Keir Starmer keeps that young and very fired up electorate on board, or whether there's some people falling off because he's just a little bit more shilly-shally, a bit more mainstream and not quite as...
Yeah.
You probably haven't seen them so much because you haven't been in Parliament, but in Liverpool we have 4 MPs who are Corbynistas and 1 who isn't. And the Corbynistas are still singing the red flag and going down with the last Labour manifesto. What does the Labour Parliamentary Party look like now? Or haven't you seen enough of them because of lockdown?
Well, I certainly haven't seen them in the last 6 weeks, and certainly I haven't seen anybody since the election of Keir Starmer. But I'd say the most, remarkable thing after the election, and we had a week in December, and then we had 3 weeks in January. Then we had half term. I mean, we haven't really been together much. But the most noticeable thing was they were shell shocked, the Labour Party. I mean, absolutely shell shocked, and they have suffered a defeat that is more comparable to our defeat in 2015, and therefore how they're regrouping and is still unknown. But definitely they knew that they couldn't keep going as before, and something needed to change. And they were also slightly, I mean, some of the Labour benches, politicians, they were just incredibly hostile and nasty towards the Liberal Democrats. And I hope that the tone will somewhat change, and that we find more areas where we can work together.
And on that, I think that's a good point to end it, because, what happens next with Labour does directly affect the Lib Dems. But all I can say on behalf of me, Richard, and all the listeners is thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. We understand how busy you'll be. It's been fascinating. It's been really interesting. And just to the other listeners out there, even though Wera is in a very strong area in Bath, or Bath, as I accidentally went northern then, is that even if you're in an area without an MP, without councillors, without whatever, even if you're in an area that you're a tiny local party, there are things you can do to start to change that. That's the important. There are, as my mentor Alan Hackett always said to me, there are no-go areas for Lib Dems. Whether you're rural, urban, whatever, there's always a chance for you to build your local party and represent people locally. So, but just thank you so much, Wera. Thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for downloading the Lib Dem Podcast. Never miss an episode by subscribing to us on YouTube or via your podcast provider. Also, check out all the latest news and details coming up on the Lib Dem Podcast by following us on social media at LibDem Pod.